The little boy promised, "I will marry you when I grow up to giant alien queen." Few years later, he returned with a ring. The sensor array pinged 3 times before Ethan Cole even looked up from his tablet, and that was the first sign something was wrong. 3 pings meant velocity beyond anything cataloged. He set the tablet down on the reinforced railing and watched the sky the way a man watches a door he has been waiting 15 years to open. Around him, the perimeter lights of the Ashford Defense Station buzzed against the dark, throwing long shadows across concrete bunkers that had once been wheat silos. Soldiers moved with the practiced calm of people who had drilled for this moment so many times that the drill itself had become a kind of numbness. Ethan did not feel numb. He felt his pulse in his throat, steady and hard, like something trying to climb out. Object entering atmosphere, a voice said through his earpiece. Trajectory consistent with controlled descent, not impact. He closed his eyes for 1 second, just one. Long enough to remember a smell that did not belong on this cold ridge at all, a smell of scorched earth and something sweeter underneath, something like ozone and copper. Long enough to remember a voice, low and resonant, asking him why he was not afraid. Then he opened his eyes and became, once again, the man everyone on this base believed him to be. Cold, exact, unshakable. "Bring up the Eastern Shield grid," he said. "Full power. Nobody fires until I give the order." He did not tell them who he thought was coming. He did not tell them that 15 years ago, before any of this base existed, before Earth even knew there was anything out there worth fearing, he had made a promise to someone the size of a barn door, and that promise was the reason every piece of technology humming to life around him existed at all. The memory came anyway, uninvited, the way memories do when the sky is on fire. He had been 10 years old, and it had been an ordinary Tuesday until it wasn't. The cornfield behind his family's house stretched flat and endless under a sky that had, until that night, only ever held stars he could name. He remembered lying in his bed listening to his parents argue quietly downstairs about money, the kind of argument meant to be hidden from a child but never quite was. He remembered the sound that cut through it. A tearing shriek, metal against air, so loud the windows rattled in their frames. He was at the window before he even decided to move. A streak of orange fire crossed the sky, low and fast, trailing black smoke, and it did not look like the shooting stars his grandmother used to point out. It looked wrong. It looked like something falling that had never meant to fall. The impact shook the house. Somewhere downstairs his mother screamed his father's name. Ethan did not wait to hear what they decided to do about it. He was already pulling on his boots. He knew he wasn't supposed to go. He knew it the way children always know the rules they are about to break. But the field beyond his window was glowing faintly orange at the tree line, and something in his chest, something he would spend the rest of his life trying to name, pulled him toward it instead of away. He ran through rows of corn taller than his head, the stalks slapping against his arms, until the ground opened up in front of him in a crater still smoking at the edges. The air was hot and smelled like a struck match. In the center of the crater, half buried in scorched dirt, sat a vessel unlike anything he had ever seen, its surface a dull gray metal veined with faint pulsing light, cracked open along one side like an egg that had hatched wrong. He should have run home. He would tell himself that later, many times in the years when guilt visited him at night. He should have run home and woken his father and let the adults handle whatever this was. Instead, he crept closer, drawn by the strange light pulsing weaker and weaker from the crack in the hull, until he was close enough to see movement inside. A hand emerged first, if it could be called a hand. Long-fingered, gray-skinned, tipped with something that might have been claws or might have simply been nails grown sharp by design. It gripped the broken edge of the hull and pulled, and what followed was not human, was not anything his 10-year-old brain had a category for. She was enormous, even collapsed and wounded, even folded awkwardly to fit through a doorway not built for someone her size. She was easily 3 times his height, her limbs long and powerful beneath skin the color of storm clouds, her face sharp-featured and alien in a way that should have sent him running. Dark fluid, faintly luminous, seeped from a wound along her side and pooled in the dirt. Her eyes found him instantly. They were the one part of her that looked almost human, dark and exhausted, and full of something he would later understand was calculation. She was deciding in that moment whether the small creature in front of her was predator, prey, or simply irrelevant. He should have screamed. He should have run. Instead, stupidly, the only thing that came out of his mouth was, "Are you hurt?" She did not answer. She could not yet, not in a language he understood. But her hand moved, slow and shaking, and closed around a jagged piece of metal near her, ready to use it as a weapon if this small thing came closer with bad intentions. Ethan took a step back, not out of fear, though there was plenty of that crawling up his spine. He took a step back because some instinct told him that showing his open hands mattered more than showing his fear. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, though the absurdity of a 10-year-old boy saying that to a creature the size of his house did not escape him even then. "I'll be right back. Don't die." He ran home faster than he had ever run in his life, past his parents still arguing in the kitchen, straight to the bathroom cabinet where his mother kept bandages and the bottle of iodine she used on his father's work cuts. He filled an old canteen with water from the tap, grabbed a flashlight, and was back out the window before either of his parents noticed he had ever come inside. The walk back to the crater felt longer this time, weighted with the certainty that what he was doing was insane. When he reached the edge again, she had not moved, but her eyes tracked him the entire way, sharp and unblinking, cataloging every step. He knelt at a distance he judged to be safe, close enough to reach her but far enough to run if her intentions changed, and held out the canteen. "Water," he said, holding it up so she could see it clearly, then setting it down and sliding it toward her with his foot. She stared at it for a long moment before her hand released the metal shard and reached instead for the canteen. Her fingers were shaking. Whatever strength had brought that vessel crashing out of the sky under some kind of control had cost her almost everything she had left. She drank slowly, watching him the entire time over the rim of the canteen, and something in her posture shifted, not to trust exactly, but to a temporary suspension of the assumption that he intended harm. He worked up the courage to approach closer, and when she did not stop him, he began wrapping the wound along her side with the bandages, his small hands clumsy and careful all at once. She hissed once at the pressure, a sound low and resonant that vibrated in his chest, but she did not pull away. For a long while neither of them spoke, because there was nothing between them yet that could be called a shared language. He worked. She watched. The crater around them steamed gently in the cold night air, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked at nothing, unaware that the largest event in the history of the county was unfolding in a cornfield behind the Cole family's house. When he finished tying off the last bandage, he sat back on his heels and looked up at her face properly for the first time since the initial shock of seeing her. Up close, she did not look like a monster. She looked exhausted. She looked like someone who had lost something enormous and was still deciding how to survive the loss. Her lips moved, and though the sound that came out was layered strangely, threaded with an undertone of something mechanical translating in real time, the words landed clearly enough in his mind. "Why aren't you afraid?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness only a child can bring to something that should terrify him. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess you looked like you needed help more than you looked like you wanted to hurt me." Something shifted in her expression, subtle and unreadable to him then, though years later he would recognize it instantly as the exact look she gave him the day she returned. It was not gratitude exactly. It was closer to surprise. The specific surprise of an ancient and battle-scarred mind discovering that mercy still existed somewhere in the universe, offered freely by something so small it could fit twice over inside one of her hands. She said nothing else that night. She simply watched him gather the empty canteen and the leftover bandages, watched him hesitate at the crater's edge before promising, in a voice far too solemn for a boy his age, that he would come back tomorrow. He did not know yet what he had found in that crater. He did not know she was royalty, or that her people were dying, or that the promise he would make to her weeks later, half in jest and half in the desperate sincerity only children possess, would one day be the reason an entire planet built its defenses around technology stolen from her broken ship. All he knew, walking back through the cornfield under a sky slowly losing its orange glow, was that something enormous had fallen out of the stars and looked at him like he mattered. He had no way of knowing that 15 years later, standing on a fortified ridge with a ring in his pocket and an army at his back, he would look up at that same sky and feel exactly the same thing. If you want to see what happens when Ethan finally comes face to face with Velara again, let me know in the comments whether you think she'll remember him first, or whether he'll have to remind her the same way he did as a boy. The barn had not been used for anything but broken machinery in years, which made it the perfect place to hide something the size of a small elephant. Ethan discovered this on the second night, when he returned to the crater with a wheelbarrow he could barely push, and a plan that made sense only to a 10-year-old mind operating on adrenaline and stubbornness. She could not walk far. The wound along her side, even wrapped, still wept that faint luminous fluid, and every few steps she stopped and pressed a hand against the dirt, breathing hard through teeth that were not quite teeth, sharper at the edges than anything in a human mouth had a right to be. It took most of the night to get her from the crater to the old barn, moving only when the moon dipped behind clouds, Ethan hissing directions in a whisper, as if volume alone might give them away to the entire sleeping county. By the time she folded herself into the shadowed corner between a rusted tractor and a collapsed hay loft, the sky had already begun turning gray at the edges. Ethan collapsed against a stack of feed bags and looked at her, this impossible creature now curled into the one place on the property nobody bothered to check, and felt for the first time the full weight of what he had done. He had hidden an alien in his family's barn. He did not have a plan beyond that. He was 10. Plans were not really his department. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them chose, but both of them accepted. He would sneak out feed meant for the animals, water, whatever medical supplies he could steal without his mother noticing the bathroom cabinet slowly emptying. In exchange, Velara, though he did not yet know her name, allowed him to sit close enough to study her, to talk at her even when she could not yet understand most of what he said, to fill the silence of her recovery with the endless chatter of a boy who had never had anyone quite so patient to listen to him. Her name arrived on the fourth day, delivered in fragments through whatever translating mechanism was buried in the collar around her neck, a device that clicked and whirred faintly whenever she spoke, smoothing her language into something his ears could parse. Velara, she told him, tapping her own chest with one long finger. He tried to say it back and mangled it so badly that something in her expression twitched, an expression he would come to recognize over the following weeks, as amusement she was too dignified to fully display. "You're laughing at me," he accused on the fifth day, after his third failed attempt at her name came out sounding like a sneeze. "I do not laugh," she said, the translation flat and precise, and yet the corner of her mouth had moved in a way that suggested otherwise. "Sure," he said, "sure you don't." Their conversations in those early days existed mostly in that space, half real communication and half performance, Ethan filling gaps with confidence and Velara correcting him with a bluntness that had no patience for human softness. When he tried to explain the concept of a birthday, an entire day dedicated to celebrating the fact that a person had simply continued existing for another year, She stared at him for a long moment before declaring it the most illogical use of resources she had encountered on this planet, which, she added, admittedly was a very short list. When he tried to teach her to shake hands, she gripped his entire forearm instead of his hand, nearly lifting him off his feet, and observed that human customs seemed designed around fragility rather than function. He laughed so hard he nearly fell over, and she watched him laugh with an expression that, had he been older, he might have recognized as something closer to wonder than judgment. Not everything was easy. There were nights she grew distant and quiet, staring at some fixed point beyond the barn walls, and when he asked what was wrong, she would only say that her people needed her, and that every day spent recovering here was a day her fleet drifted further from where she was supposed to be. He did not understand the scale of what she meant. He assumed, the way children assume, that her problems were like his problems, solvable with enough time and effort. He did not yet know that the empire she ruled was already beginning its slow collapse, hunted by something she refused to name even in the privacy of that barn. The tension outside the barn walls grew in its own quiet way. His mother noticed first, the way mothers notice everything eventually. She found dirt on his boots that did not match the yard, noticed food disappearing from the pantry in quantities that made no sense for one growing boy. And one evening at dinner, she asked him directly, voice careful in the way adults get when they suspect something and are afraid of the answer, what exactly he had been doing out past dark every night that week. He lied. He was good at it by then, practiced through repetition, telling her he had been exploring the old Miller property down the road, chasing raccoons out of the shed, anything that sounded boring enough to end the conversation. His father, distracted by the endless list of worries that came with running a struggling farm, let it go faster than his mother did, though the suspicion in her eyes lingered every time Ethan left the house after dinner. The greater threat arrived in the form of Sheriff Dale Higgins, a broad-shouldered man with a tendency toward boredom who had, until that week, spent most of his patrols investigating stolen livestock and teenagers drinking behind the grain silo. Reports had started coming in of strange lights near the coal property, a few neighbors mentioning odd sounds carried on the wind at night, low and resonant, unlike anything native to the county. Higgins made it his personal mission to figure out what was going on, driving slowly past the property more evenings than Ethan liked, his headlights sweeping close enough to the barn that Ethan's heart climbed into his throat every single time. It was during this stretch of mounting risk that the moment happened, the one Ethan would return to 1,000 times in the years that followed, turning it over like a stone worn smooth from handling. It was late, past midnight, the kind of quiet that only exists in small towns where everything shuts down by 9. Velara was stronger by then, able to sit upright without the visible strain of the earlier days, and Ethan had snuck out with nothing more than a flashlight and the restless energy of a boy who could not sleep. He sat beside her in the dark, close enough that her shadow swallowed his entirely, and for a while neither of them spoke. It was Ethan who broke the silence, the way he always did, filling quiet spaces because silence made him nervous in a way her enormous presence somehow did not. "When you go back to your ship," he said, "will I ever see you again?" The question hung there longer than he expected. Velara's eyes, dark and depthless in the low light, studied him with an intensity that made him feel, not for the first time, that she was measuring something in him far beyond his years. "It is unlikely," she said finally, her voice carrying none of the softness humans use to cushion hard truths. "My fleet is far. My duties do not permit sentiment." He absorbed this the way children absorb heavy things, quickly and without full understanding, filing the pain away to be examined later. Then, because he was 10. And because 10-year-old logic operates on a different plane entirely from adult caution, he said the thing that would define the rest of his life. "Then I'll come find you," he said. "When I'm grown up. I'll build something that can go up there and I'll find your ship and I'll marry you, so you'll have to see me again whether you like it or not." The silence that followed was long enough that he worried he had said something wrong, something offensive in whatever culture she came from. But when she finally spoke, her voice had shifted into something quieter than before, something almost gentle. "You are very small to be making promises that large," she said. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I still mean it." She studied him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that he would not understand until much later, a flicker of an emotion she had not expected to feel toward a creature so small and so fragile and so entirely unafraid of her. It was not romantic, not yet, not in the way he meant it as a child. It was something closer to being witnessed, truly witnessed, by someone who saw her not as royalty or as weapon or as threat, but simply as someone worth helping. "Very well," she said finally, and there was no mockery in it at all. "If you manage such a thing, I will hold you to it." He grinned, satisfied in the way only children can be satisfied by promises whose weight they do not yet understand, and neither of them spoke of it again for the rest of that night. The end came 2 days later, sudden and unwelcome. Her ship, which had spent its recovery period quietly repairing itself using systems Ethan did not understand, finally stabilized enough to send a signal outward into the dark, a signal that would summon rescue or retrieval from whatever remained of her fleet. She told him plainly, without the ceremony he might have wanted, that she would be leaving within the day. He helped her walk back to the crater one final time, the same path they had taken in reverse weeks earlier, and stood at the edge of the ship's opening as she prepared to seal herself inside for departure. She turned back once, looking down at him with an expression he could not fully name, and reached out one long finger to touch, briefly, the top of his head, the closest thing to a human gesture she had. "Grow strong, small one," she said, "and do not forget what you promised." He never did. If you think Ethan actually stood a chance at keeping that promise, or if you think Velara ever really believed he would, drop your thoughts in the comments before the next chapter picks up 15 years later. The compound smelled like coffee and cold metal at 4 in the morning, which was the only time Ethan Cole ever felt like the world made sense. He stood in front of a wall of monitors in a bunker buried 40 feet beneath what used to be his family's second cornfield, watching data scroll past faster than any human eye should be able to track, and did not blink. 15 years had reshaped him into something his 10-year-old self would not have recognized. Gone was the soft roundness of a farm boy's face, replaced by the sharp, tired angles of a man who had spent more nights awake than asleep. A scar cut through one eyebrow, souvenir from an early prototype that had exploded before it should have. His hands, calloused and precise, moved across the console with the fluency of someone who had built half the systems in this bunker himself. Nobody at Ashford Station knew the full story of why Ethan Cole had dedicated his entire adult life to alien technology reverse engineering. They knew the official version, the one in his file, the one that said a farm boy had stumbled onto crashed debris as a child and grown obsessed with understanding it. They did not know about the barn. They did not know about the promise. They did not know that every circuit he decoded, every shield harmonic he calibrated, was built on fragments of memory from watching a wounded queen's ship slowly repair itself using principles humanity would not otherwise understand for another century. He had told no one, not his superiors, not the scientists who treated him like a savant they could not quite explain, not even the few people he had let close enough to call friends. The secret had calcified inside him over the years into something less like a secret and more like a private religion, practiced alone, in silence, in the specific ache that lived behind his ribs every time he activated a system whose blueprint had once been etched into a barn wall by starlight. "Dr. Reyes," he said, without turning from the monitors, "run the harmonic resonance again on Sector 7. I don't like the drift." Reyes, a woman in her 50s who had learned years ago not to question Ethan's instincts even when the data didn't yet support them, tapped at her own console. "It's within tolerance, Ethan. You've been staring at this for 6 hours." Tolerance isn't the same as correct, he said. This was the world Ethan Cole had built, quietly, methodically, for a decade and a half. Earth's governments, after enough leaked reports and enough panicked scientists confirming that the debris in a small Midwestern county was not of terrestrial origin, had moved with uncharacteristic speed once the scale of the technology became clear. What followed was the largest and most secretive military buildup in human history, hidden behind press releases about renewable energy initiatives and satellite defense contracts, while beneath the surface, an entire planet quietly armed itself against a threat the public was never told to fear. Ethan had risen through that machinery not through ambition, but through necessity. He was the only person alive who had witnessed alien technology in its living, functioning state, who had watched a ship stitch its own hull back together, who understood instinctively what others had to reverse engineer through years of trial and error. His obsession, which his superiors mistook for genius and his rare friends mistook for workaholism, was in truth something far simpler and far heavier. He was building a fortress for a promise he intended to keep. He had never married. There had been women, briefly, relationships that ended not because of cruelty but because of distance, the particular distance of a man who was always somewhere else in his head, standing in a cornfield beside something enormous and patient. He did not tell any of them why. He barely let himself examine it in full daylight. It was easier to work. The alert came at 4:47 in the morning, cutting through the ambient hum of the bunker like a blade. Long-range detection, a technician called out from across the room, panic threading through the professional calm they had all trained so hard to maintain. Multiple contacts. Configuration doesn't match anything in the threat catalog. Ethan was at the secondary station before Ray's finished pulling up the feed. Numbers scrolled across the display, coordinates, velocities, mass estimates that made no sense for anything built by human hands. He watched the shapes resolve on the tactical display, dozens of them, then hundreds, a formation too vast and too disciplined to be anything but a fleet. "Show me hull configuration," he said, voice flat despite the sudden hammering of his heart. The image that populated the screen a moment later hit him like a physical blow. The angular plating, the faint bioluminescent veining along the hull seams, the elongated command spires, all of it matched, not exactly but close enough, the wreckage he had spent 15 years studying down to the smallest fragment. He had built an entire defense grid around technology descended from ships built exactly like these. "Sir," Ray said carefully, watching his face, "do you recognize this?" He did not answer immediately. His mind was already racing backward, through 15 years of quiet obsession, to a single conversation in a dark barn, to a voice telling him that her fleet was far and her duties did not permit sentiment, to a warning she had given him on their final night together that he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself he imagined it. "If I ever return," she had said, "it may not be as someone you remember fondly. Duty changes what a person is willing to do." He straightened, forcing his voice into the calm authority the room needed from him now. "This isn't a first contact scenario," he said. "This is a refugee fleet, or a fleeing one. Look at the formation, the escort pattern around the central cluster. That's not an invasion posture. That's protection." "Protection from what?" Reyes asked. He didn't answer, because the answer arrived on its own 30 seconds later, when the secondary sensor array picked up a second signature trailing the first fleet by several hours, larger, faster, configured in a way that made every instinct in Ethan's body scream danger before the analysis even finished processing. Where Velara's fleet? If it was her fleet, moved with the disciplined desperation of something running, this second signature moved with the cold, patient efficiency of something hunting. "Get me command," Ethan said, and this time there was no calm left in his voice at all, only urgency. "Get me every defense division online. Whatever's coming, it's not alone, and whatever's chasing it isn't interested in negotiation." The next several hours dissolved into the particular chaos of a species discovering, with no time to prepare emotionally for what their bodies had already been preparing physically for 15 years, that the moment they had trained for was finally here. Command scrambled satellites, activated the full shield grid across 17 fortified cities, and mobilized every asset built from the bones of that first crashed ship, while Ethan stood at the center of it, the architect of a war he had never told anyone he was fighting for personal reasons. Around hour 6, alone in a side room with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, he allowed himself 30 seconds to remember, fully and without interruption, the last conversation he'd had with Velara before she flew out of his life. He remembered the weight of her hand on his head, the size of it, larger than his entire skull, and the strange gentleness in a gesture that should have crushed him. He remembered the exact cadence of her voice, mechanical and warm at once, telling him to grow strong. He remembered, most of all, the promise itself, spoken with the reckless certainty only a child possesses, and the 15 years of quiet, disciplined labor he had poured into making sure that promise would not die the moment reality caught up to it. He had built ships. He had built shields. He had built weapons drawn from principles no other human on the planet fully understood, all under the guise of national defense, all in service of a vow made in a barn to someone who might not even remember his face. He set the coffee down and returned to the command floor, where the tactical display now showed Velara's fleet entering high orbit, close enough that visual confirmation would be possible within the hour. The pursuing fleet trailed behind at a distance that would close within days, not weeks, a fact that turned the entire situation from a diplomatic problem into a countdown. General Whitfield, the officer nominally in charge of Ashford's defense coordination, found him staring at the display and asked the question everyone in the room was too afraid to voice aloud. "Cole," he said, "you've spent 15 years building this division around alien tech nobody else could understand. Now we've got an alien fleet in our orbit and something even worse behind it. I need to know right now if you know something the rest of us don't." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, watching the cluster of ships on the display, one signature among them slightly larger than the rest, positioned at the heart of the formation, the way a queen is positioned at the heart of a hive. "I might," he said finally, "but you're not going to like how I know it." Whitfield studied him, waiting. 15 years ago, Ethan said, I made a promise to someone I never expected to see again. I think she's about to make me keep it." The fleet breached low orbit 2 hours later, and the entire world, unknowing and unprepared in every way except the one Ethan had spent his life building, held its breath. If you think Velara remembers that promise the moment she sees Earth's defenses, or if you think she's too consumed by her empire's survival to notice, let me know in the comments before the reunion finally happens in the next chapter. The descent shuttle broke atmosphere at a speed that should have torn it apart, its hull glowing amber at the edges, and every radar operator at Ashford Station watched it come down with their fingers hovering over triggers they had been trained their entire careers to pull. Ethan stood behind them, arms crossed, and said nothing, because the shape of that shuttle, the particular curve of its wings, the way it cut through turbulence like it was apologizing for the disturbance, matched something buried so deep in his memory that his chest had gone tight the moment it appeared on the display. "Hold fire," he said. "Nobody so much as breathes on a trigger until I say otherwise." The shuttle landed in the open field designated for exactly this scenario, a mile beyond the fortified perimeter, ringed by enough firepower to level a mountain if given the order. Steam hissed from its undercarriage as it settled into the grass, and for a long moment nothing happened at all, the whole base holding its breath in unison. Then the hatch opened, and Velara stepped out into the cold morning light of a planet she had last seen 15 years ago as a wounded fugitive hiding in a farm boy's barn. She was exactly as enormous as Ethan remembered, and somehow more so, because memory has a way of shrinking things that time has only made larger. She wore armor now, dark and functional, etched with markings that spoke of rank rather than decoration. And behind her, descending in a slower and more cautious procession, came a retinue of advisors and guards, all of them scanning the fortified ridgeline with expressions that shifted rapidly from wary confidence to something closer to alarm. Ethan watched her face as she took in the shield towers ringing the horizon, the defense grid humming visibly in the pre-dawn light, the unmistakable architecture of technology that could only have come from one place. He watched the exact moment her expression cracked, just slightly, from the composed mask of a queen arriving to negotiate with primitives into something far more uncertain. This was not the plan, one of her advisors muttered in a language the translation collar caught and rendered into clipped, formal English for the benefit of the human officers standing nearby. This world was catalogued as pre-industrial. That catalog is 15 years out of date, Ethan said, stepping forward from the command line before Whitfield could stop him. Every head turned toward him, human and alien alike. Velara's gaze found him last, sweeping past the officers and soldiers with the disinterest of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, until it landed on his face and simply stopped. He watched her search his features, the sharp adult angles that had replaced the soft roundness of a child's face, the scar through his eyebrow, the exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He watched her not recognize him, not entirely, not yet, and something in his chest ached at the specific unfairness of having thought about this moment every day for 15 years, while she had likely thought about it only rarely, if at all, buried beneath the weight of an empire's survival. "You have the look of someone who wishes to speak," she said finally, addressing him with the formal detachment she likely gave every human official she had been briefed to expect. "State your position." "Do you remember a boy?" he said, and his voice, despite 15 years of training himself into stillness, shook slightly on the words. 10 years old, a crashed ship in a cornfield, a barn with a hole in the roof, someone who thought birthdays were an illogical use of resources. The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds, which was long enough for every officer on that ridge to feel it, long enough for her advisors to exchange glances sharp with confusion, long enough for Whitfield to shoot Ethan a look that promised a very long conversation later. Velara's composure did not shatter, not visibly, not in front of her counsel, but something behind her eyes shifted entirely. 15 years collapsing into a single moment of recognition so total that, for just an instant, the queen disappeared, and what remained was something closer to the wounded creature who had once watched a small boy approach her with a canteen of water and no fear at all. "Ethan," she said, and his name in her mouth, translated through mechanical precision but carrying an unmistakable weight of memory, undid something in his chest that 15 years of discipline had kept carefully locked away. "Yes," he said simply. "You built this," she said, gesturing without looking away from him at the fortified ridge line, the shield towers, the entire architecture of a planet that had transformed itself from prey into something capable of standing eye to eye with an empire. "Most of it," he said, "started with what I remembered from your ship. Took a while to get it right." One of her advisors, a narrow-faced official whose armor bore markings of considerable seniority, stepped forward with visible agitation. "My queen," he said, "this is unacceptable. You cannot possibly have personal history with a specimen of this species. It compromises the integrity of these negotiations before they have even begun." "Careful," Velara said. Without raising her voice, without even turning to look at him, and yet the word landed with enough force that the advisor took a physical step backward. "This specimen, as you call him, is the reason your queen survived long enough to lead you here at all." The tension on the field was thick enough that Ethan could feel it pressing against his skin. Human soldiers glancing at each other, with expressions caught between confusion and dark amusement at the sight of an alien official being scolded like a child. while Velara's retinue struggled visibly to reconcile the image of their formidable queen with the possibility that her history included a farm boy and a barn. "We have larger concerns than personal history," another advisor said, this one older, her voice carrying the particular weariness of someone who had survived many crises and expected this to be merely another. "The pursuit fleet will breach this system within days. We require this world's defenses integrated with our own if either of us is to survive what is coming." Ethan felt the shift in the air immediately, the negotiation sliding from personal reunion into the cold calculus of military alliance, and he understood, watching Velara's face carefully, that she was being pulled in the same direction, torn visibly between the queen who had responsibilities to an entire dying civilization, and the woman who had just recognized, standing in front of her, the boy who once fed her broth by candlelight and asked for nothing in return except her survival. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, where he had carried the ring every single day for the past 3 years, since the moment his defense work had progressed far enough that he allowed himself to believe this day might actually come. It was not an extravagant thing, forged from a rare alloy salvaged from the original crashed ship, shaped by his own hands over months of careful, obsessive work, because no human jeweler could be trusted with a secret this large, and no human ring would have fit a hand the size of hers regardless. "I made a promise once," he said, loud enough that every officer and every alien advisor on that field heard him clearly. "I told her I'd marry her when I grew up. I've spent 15 years building the kind of world that could make that promise mean something instead of just a child's fantasy." He held up the ring, and the morning light caught the alloy, and for a moment the entire field went utterly silent, human soldiers staring in disbelief at their most secretive weapons architect proposing marriage to an alien queen in the middle of a first contact negotiation, alien advisors staring in horror at the audacity of a lesser species addressing royalty with such presumption. "This is not diplomacy," the narrow-faced advisor said, his voice climbing toward outrage. "This is a farce. You cannot possibly expect the Council to recognize a bond between the Queen and a creature that barely reaches her waist." "I don't expect you to recognize a bond," Ethan said, turning to face him directly. "I expect you to recognize an equal. Every shield tower on this ridge, every weapon system that's going to help your fleet survive what's chasing you, exists because a 10-year-old boy decided a wounded stranger deserved help instead of fear. If your council can't respect that, then maybe you don't deserve the alliance you're here asking for." Velara had not spoken during this exchange, her expression unreadable in the way it had been the first night he met her, calculating, weighing, the queen and the woman wrestling visibly behind her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that silenced even her most agitated advisor. "He is correct," she said, "about more than he knows." She stepped closer, close enough that Ethan had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes properly, the same way he had as a child. And for a moment, the 15 years between them collapsed entirely into the memory of a barn lit only by a flashlight and the reckless promise of a boy who had no idea what he was offering. "I told you once that duty does not permit sentiment," she said, quiet enough now that only he could hear it clearly over the murmur of the assembled officials. "I have spent 15 years believing that to be true. I find, standing here, that I am no longer certain." Her council erupted into a fresh wave of protest at her words, voices overlapping in a language the translation collars struggled to keep pace with, demands and warnings and formal objections cascading around them, and through all of it Velara did not look away from Ethan's face. "The council will not accept this union," the elder advisor said finally, her voice cutting through the noise with the finality of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Not without proof that this world is worth the cost of the alliance you are proposing, and not without the Queen setting aside a sentiment unbefitting her station. We will not risk the survival of our people on the strength of a child's promise." Velara straightened, and when she spoke again, her voice had returned to the formal register of a ruler addressing her court, though something in her eyes, fixed still on Ethan, had not fully returned to that same distance. "Then it seems," she said, "we have much to negotiate and very little time in which to do it." Behind her, in the pale light of a sky that would soon carry a second, far more dangerous fleet into view, her council began arguing amongst themselves about terms, about proof, about the cost of trusting a world they had arrived expecting to conquer rather than court, while Ethan stood with the ring still held between his fingers, uncertain for the first time in 15 years whether the promise he had spent his whole life preparing to keep would be allowed to matter at all. "If you think Velara's council will accept the alliance, or if you think they'll force her to choose between her crown and the promise she made as a wounded stranger in a barn, let me know in the comments before the final battle decides everything in the next chapter." The pursuit fleet breached the outer edge of the system 40 hours after Velara's council delivered its verdict, and the verdict, when it came, satisfied no one. The council would not recognize the Union. Not yet. Not on the strength of a promise made by a child to a wounded stranger, however moving the story had proven to the human officers who had heard it. What they would recognize, the elder advisor declared with the flat finality of someone who had spent decades negotiating treaties on the edge of extinction, was survival. If Earth's defenses could withstand what was coming, if the alliance proved itself in blood rather than sentiment, then and only then would the question of Velara's personal life be revisited. Ethan had expected disappointment. What he felt instead, standing on the command floor of Ashford Station 40 hours later watching the pursuit fleet's signatures multiply across the tactical display, was something closer to grim clarity. "Fine," he thought. "We'll earn it the hard way." The pursuit fleet, once visual confirmation resolved its true shape, turned out to be worse than anyone had modeled. Where Velara's ships carried the elegant, organic curves of a civilization that valued both function and beauty, the hunting fleet was built entirely for efficiency, angular black hulls devoid of ornamentation, weapons arrays so dense the ships seemed constructed around them rather than the reverse. Sensor analysis confirmed what Ethan had already suspected from the first fragmentary reports. This species did not negotiate. It did not take prisoners. It had exterminated 3 other civilizations in the region before setting its sights on Velara's dying empire, and it viewed humanity, upon detecting Earth's presence in its target system, as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle to be cleared before the true extermination began. "Command Ethan," Reyes called across the floor, 48 hours to first contact. "Combined fleet coordination protocols are ready, but sir, we've never run a joint engagement with alien command structures before. There's no telling how this holds together under fire." "It'll hold," Ethan said, "because it had to." The 48 hours that followed dissolved into the controlled chaos of 2 civilizations learning to fight as one. Velara's engineers, initially skeptical of human technology despite its clear lineage from their own, grudgingly integrated their targeting systems with Earth's shield grid once live simulations proved the combination increased effective defense radius by nearly 40%. Ethan worked alongside alien tacticians twice his height, translating 15 years of solitary study into real-time battlefield coordination, and found, in the exhausting intimacy of shared crisis, that his fluency in their systems ran deeper than even he had realized. He did not just understand their technology. He understood the philosophy behind it, the way it prioritized adaptability over raw power, the way it had been built by a people who valued survival through cleverness rather than survival through size. Velara found him twice during those 48 hours, brief stolen moments in the chaos of preparation, and each time the conversation carried a different weight than their reunion had. There was no time now for the careful diplomacy of the negotiation field. There was only the specific honesty of people who might not survive what was coming. "You built all of this for me," she said the second time, standing in a corridor outside the command center, her voice low enough that the officers passing by could not overhear. I built it because you told me your fleet was far and your duties didn't permit sentiment, he said. I figured the only way to fix that was to make sure Earth had enough sentiment banked up for both of us. She studied him with an expression he had not seen since the barn, something unguarded slipping through the composed authority of a queen who had spent 15 years ruling a dying empire. My council believes I am compromised, she said, that my judgment cannot be trusted where you are concerned. Are they wrong? He asked. She did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough that he thought perhaps he had pushed further than the moment allowed. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped into something quieter, something that belonged only to the two of them. They are entirely correct, she said. I simply no longer see that as the failure they believe it to be. The battle began at 300 hours, and it did not resemble anything in Ethan's 15 years of tactical planning, because no simulation could have accounted for the specific chaos of human and alien forces learning each other's rhythms in real time, while an extermination fleet bore down with mechanical, joyless efficiency. The first wave hit Velara's outer escort ships hard, 3 vessels crippled within the opening minutes, and Ethan watched from the command floor as the shield grid he had spent 15 years perfecting absorbed the overflow of that assault, buying the wounded ships enough time to limp behind Earth's defensive line. It was, in its own brutal way, the fulfillment of everything he had built toward, technology born from her civilization, now standing between her people and annihilation. But the twist came 6 hours into the engagement, delivered not by the enemy fleet, but by Velara's own council. Rays flagged the anomaly first, a change in formation among several of Velara's mid-tier warships, vessels quietly repositioning away from the joint defensive line and toward Earth's primary shield generators, the very heart of the technology keeping both fleets alive. Ethan, she said, voice tight, I don't like what I'm seeing on Sector 4. Those ships are moving into position to seize our core systems, not defend them. He pulled up the feed and understood immediately what he was looking at. Somewhere in the chaos of battle, the elder advisor and a faction of the council had made their move, calculating that the surest path to their empire's survival was not alliance but appropriation, seizing Earth's shield technology outright, once the immediate threat was neutralized, and treating humanity, regardless of the alliance's terms, as a resource to be harvested rather than a partner to be honored. They had used the crisis as cover, gambling that no one would notice the betrayal until it was already complete. Get me Velara, Ethan said, and there was no calm left in his voice at all. She answered within seconds, her voice sharp with the specific fury of someone realizing her own people had moved against the very alliance she had staked her reputation on. I am already aware, she said before he could speak. My council has exceeded its authority. I am addressing it now. What followed was not a battle Ethan witnessed directly, but one he pieced together afterward from fragmented reports and Velara's own account, delivered in the quiet hours after everything had settled. She had confronted the elder advisor personally, in the command chamber of her flagship, in front of the entire remaining council, and made a choice that would define the rest of her reign far more than any treaty could. She refused the betrayal outright. Not quietly, not through diplomatic maneuvering, but publicly, stripping the advisor of his authority in the middle of an active battle, and redirecting the mid-tier warships back to the defensive line they had abandoned, an act that some among her council would later call the moment she chose a lesser species over her own empire's survival, and an act that Ethan, when he finally heard the full account, understood as the truest proof of everything he had believed about her since he was 10 years old. The battle turned in Earth's favor roughly 9 hours after it began, not through any single decisive strike, but through the grinding attrition of a defense grid built specifically to outlast rather than overpower, human shield technology and alien weapon systems, working in a rhythm neither side had ever tested before, but which held, against every reasonable expectation, long enough for the extermination fleet's commanders to recognize the engagement had become unprofitable. They withdrew at the 12th hour, not defeated exactly, but denied the swift, clean extermination they had come expecting, and Ethan watched the enemy's signatures retreat from the tactical display with the specific exhaustion of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for a single day and had somehow survived it. The council chamber, when Ethan finally stood inside it 2 days later, was quieter than he expected, the elder advisor conspicuously absent, stripped of his position, and confined pending judgment for the attempted seizure. Velara stood at the center of the remaining council, and when Ethan entered, escorted by officers who still did not fully understand what they were witnessing, every alien official in the room turned to look at him with an expression that had shifted, unmistakably, from the wary contempt of their first meeting into something closer to reluctant respect. "The council recognizes the alliance," the elder female advisor said, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone conceding a point she had genuinely not expected to concede. "Your world's defenses proved themselves beyond dispute, and the Queen has made her position regarding this human unmistakably clear, at considerable cost to her own standing among us." Ethan looked at Velara, who watched him now without the careful composure she had worn at their first reunion, without the Queen's mask fully in place, simply as the woman who had once told a 10-year-old boy that duty did not permit sentiment and had spent 15 years, it turned out, quietly hopping to be proven wrong. He stepped forward and, in front of the full council, in front of human officers who had followed him into that chamber, still not quite believing the scale of what their quiet, obsessive colleague had built his entire life toward, held out the ring one final time. "I told you I'd come find you," he said. "I told you I'd build something that could reach your fleet, and I'd marry you whether you liked it or not." Velara knelt, an act that visibly startled her counsel, bringing herself low enough that her eyes met his without him needing to tilt his head back at all, and reached out one long finger to touch the ring resting in his palm. "I believe," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of that silent chamber, "that I have been waiting 15 years to be found." She accepted the ring in front of the full assembly of her council and the officers of Earth's Defense Command, an act that bound far more than two individuals, a treaty written not in formal language, but in the specific, undeniable proof of a promise kept against every reasonable expectation of failure. In the months that followed, the work of building trust between two civilizations proved far harder than the battle that had forced them together, full of friction and misunderstanding, and the slow, grinding labor of translating not just language but philosophy. But Ethan faced it the way he had faced everything since he was 10 years old, without hesitation, standing beside the enormous, patient, formidable woman who had once watched a small boy offer her water in the dark and decided, against every instinct her position demanded, that mercy was worth trusting. If you believe the promise was worth 15 years of waiting, or if you think the real work for Ethan and Velara is only just beginning, let me know in the comments what you think their alliance builds next.